We are Chris Lee and Blake Lovell of Southeastern 14, continuing our preview series of SEC football schedules for the coming season. Today, we arrive at the Auburn Tigers, who had an interesting offseason. I mean, it's always interesting at Auburn, but particularly interesting with the coaching change. Auburn now guided by Hugh Freeze and a schedule that I've got broken down into four parts. That will be interesting as well, Blake, to see how the Tigers manage what should be a fairly challenging slate, which you get by default by playing in the SEC West.
Yeah, it's just the way it is. I mean, you said you just kind of know what to expect when it comes to that. And yeah, I mean, I think it's just like we said, I think the bigger issue with breaking down Auburn's schedule is knowing exactly what Auburn's going to be and, at what point in the season do they maybe take that step forward? Do they overachieve? Do they underachieve? I think those are the biggest questions. So when you break the schedule down, you're trying to figure out, how they compare. And like you said, I think the SEC West, we always say it, I think it's just impossible sometimes to to know 1 through 7. How do you rank these teams going into the season? And I think that's the case again this season. When you just look at kind of the way things stack up. So yeah, when you look at this schedule, there are some obvious interesting spots like we talked about with other schedules. Any team that gets the two from the SEC West, Alabama and LSU, the two favorites there, and gets Georgia, which Auburn gets all the time, or at least they have kind of to this point. It's just a hard schedule, and so it's really trying to navigate all those other games around it, and maybe hoping you can pull off an upset with one of those games against some of those top tier, top 10 type teams. So.
All right, the season starts with the first three games, which I will call the break-in phase to the season. Auburn opens with UMass, which is maybe the worst team in the FBS, the composite power poll that we assembled from four sources that we've got scrolling across the bottom of our screen. Think so. Just for full disclosure, though, we always like to give little tidbits about teams. It doesn't mean that UMass is going to beat your team, Auburn fans. We get those things in the
That's
comments
exactly what
sometimes.
Chris is saying. Chris is saying
You're
he is
right.
telling you that every
Calling it
non-conference
now.
opponent you are going to lose. I'm just kidding. That's what we do. We're trying to break down the schedule. So yes, we're trying to give you the best of these non-conference opponents. There you go. So.
Yeah, well, A&M played UMass a year ago, and A&M had its issues, but UMass did have a pretty good defense a year ago. Now, it had the worst offense in the FBS. It averaged 12 and a half points a game, but UMass did play Texas A&M within 17 points. I think that game was a 35-point spread. So just saying it's your opener. You got a team that was able to defend a little bit last year, new season. I don't really think that UMass is going to give Auburn a huge game, but just going to point that out as a point of information from last year. Then a road trip to Cal under offensive coordinator Jack Spavital. That's a name that people in the SEC know. And then Samford, which I think was it a year or two ago, gave Florida an absolute fit in a basketball score type game. Samford is ranked 13th in Athlon, and I think 7th preseason by the coaches. And certainly that in-state component, you know that Samford will be up for that game. So Auburn should go 3-0 to start the season. We'll do predictions in another video, but that is what I will call the break-in phase of Auburn's schedule, Blake.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, I think it's just a matter of looking at those games, early on and knowing that this may still be an Auburn team that's trying to figure some things out and trying to adjust to different things. We always say it, summertime, springtime, you can go through kind of, trying to put everything in, but once you actually get out there and play a different opponent, things are a little bit different. And I think that's the case here when you just look at the way the schedule's set up. I think it's nice to have those 3 games. Now, again, that game at Cal, let's go ahead and put the hashtag in Pac-12 after dark. Like that's going to be the case for that, September 9th game. That's a 10:30 Eastern game. So I think it's on ESPN. So that's a late night game, in Pac. I mean, we know how those games can go sometimes. They can be very wild. So I'm very curious to see how that game plays out. But yeah, I mean, I think you just look at it. These are 3 games that I think if you're Auburn, you are going to learn a lot more about yourself. And I know you can say that like, well, it's UMass and Samford and so forth, but I think at least that gives us an idea with these first 3 games, and specifically the one at Cal, where this team sits, kind of heading into a gauntlet of SEC games. The next 4 after that are pretty brutal, just the way the schedule sets up. So.
Yeah, I've referred to it as the brutality phase of the schedule. That's what I'm calling it. And here's what you've got, Auburn. You've got a trip to A&M followed by a game against Georgia. Good news, you get a bye week in here. Then a trip to LSU, and then Ole Miss at home, and a game that some people might be interested in following, I would guess.
Maybe. I mean, it's possible. Um, yeah, I mean, those games. I think are just kind of a like you said. This is at A&M, Georgia, at LSU, Ole Miss. I mean, it is just. I mean, look, right now, they're Auburn's probably the underdog in all four of those games, and I think again, you're talking about a team that's going to be picked lower in the SEC West based on the fact that there's a new coach in place and just trying to figure out if the roster can sort of keep up with all these other teams that are projected ahead of them. And so I think if you look at these four games, and like you said, I mean, it's just even the two games you get at home, right? It's against Georgia, who hasn't lost, in a century now. It feels like it's against Ole Miss, who, yes, there will be some drama there with the whole Lane Kiffin and Hugh Freeze, and just what an interesting sort of dynamic that is, right? And so, but yeah, I mean, we talked about the first three games, the one at Cal specifically, but these are the games that really tell you kind of how far Auburn is along in the Hugh Freeze era, even in year one. Like these are the kind of games that tell you where they are, and these could also be the games, quite honestly, that tell you, okay, if we go into next off season, maybe these are the four games we look back at and say, boy, we really have to address these areas or these areas to get on that level. And I think that's exactly what you'll find out here. It's nice to have that bye week in between them, but that's not an easy slate with these four. So.
Next phase is what I call the manageable portion of the schedule. That doesn't mean Auburn's going to win all these games, but certainly would have a shot. That's Mississippi State, at Vanderbilt, at Arkansas, and then New Mexico State. Mississippi State changing coaches and systems of its own, so that'll be interesting. Both teams at the point in the season where they are getting used to new management and new ways of doing things. At Vandy, I know Auburn fans would probably circle that as an easy win, but I think Kentucky and Florida did a year ago. That game was at this point of the season for Vanderbilt a year ago. Both of them wound up upset as double-digit favorites. So there's that. Again, Auburn will be further along in learning its systems and such, but beware of Vandy at that point of the season based on what we saw a year ago. At Arkansas, another game which will not be easy. I think Auburn lost that one, I want to say 41-27 a year ago, but certainly in the West, you've got Alabama and LSU. Then you've got a bunch of teams kind of right there, and you just never know from week to week what that's going to look like. So I think that should be a pretty evenly matched game. And then New Mexico State, which is traditionally probably a bottom five team in the FBS. I think New Mexico State is 120 in our composite, but just as a note, Jerry Kill, who's been at Minnesota,
Just as a note,
got
New
the
Mexico
Aggies.
State's going to beat
Just as a
Auburn.
note,
That's what Chris is
that's
saying.
what I'm
So.
saying. Right. He did get them to a bowl game a year ago. I think that was their second since 1960. 30th in total defense a year ago. 5 starters returning. No, do I expect New Mexico State to beat Auburn? I don't, but I'm just saying it might not be a 40-point blowout. We'll see how that goes. But that is the manageable portion of the schedule, in my opinion, Blake. And that's where Auburn needs to win probably, I don't know, 2, at least 3 of these if it's going to make a bowl game.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, we joke about the New Mexico State thing, but it is. I mean, you're trying to really get a gauge on where these teams are at, and yeah, I mean that's the way we've looked at these other schedules and we look at these kind of teams and we've if you've watched all of our schedule previews, maybe you're not just an Auburn fan, but if you watch them all, we've grouped a lot of these teams like Auburn, Mississippi State, Arkansas. We've kind of said like it's impossible. It feels like right now to know exactly how these games are going to play out when it gets to this point on the schedule because we don't exactly know what we're going to get maybe from these teams. And so I think that's probably one of the bigger questions when you look at the schedule is when you get these games between those kind of teams in the West and those three specifically, Mississippi State, Auburn, and Arkansas. Those are the games that will decide probably if these teams can make bowl games. Because when you look at the others, there are some challenges on the schedule, as we know, with the other teams. And so, yeah, I mean, those are big ones, I think, for Arkansas. Yeah, I mean, getting Mississippi State at Jordan Hare, having to go to Vanderbilt, like we said, I think Vanderbilt's going to be improved, but curious to see kind of what would that line be right now if you set it between Auburn and Vanderbilt. I don't know that it's that big of a line, probably, just based on where the two teams are at. So, um, in the Arkansas, that's a team that has been a little up and down at times. Certainly, there have been injuries, but they have high expectations. Fan base has high expectations, as we know, heading into the season. So that's a big game, later in the season in Fayetteville. So yeah, those are the swing games. Those can decide whether you are going bowling in Hugh Freeze's first season or not. So.
Just as a note on that Vandy game, I think people know that we are in the Nashville area, and I was over on campus last week. But do you know what's present in the football stadium where there used to be a closed end zone?
What's that?
Right now, it's a large hole.
Hmm.
So Auburn Vanderbilt is sort of the destination road trip for other SEC schools where they
You
can
don't
come in and
say.
get tickets and dominate. And you don't say, and to kind of dominate the crowd in a road environment, an alleged road environment. But in any case,
There will be
I'm
some Auburn
guessing
fans
that
there.
there will be some Auburn fans, but this is a public service announcement. That stadium used to seat 40,000 people. I'm guessing it's closer to 28 to 30 right now. So tickets will not be as abundant as they have been in the past. So if you're circling that as a road trip, you might want to get your ducks in a row before you make it without tickets. Just letting people know.
I think that's worse for Vandy fans than it is opposing
It
fan
might
bases.
it might be.
Hey, look, Auburn brought a lot of people to the basketball game this year, didn't they? Auburn's
Right.
always brought a lot of people.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the Auburn faithful will be well represented at First Bank Stadium in Nashville. So
Auburn's got a pretty significant alumni base in town and fan
they do.
base in
I think
town.
they're always doing alumni stuff in Nashville, from what I see on Twitter and such. So yeah.
We should do a top 10 of SEC fan bases in Nashville video at some point.
Boy, unfortunately for
Work on that.
Vanderbilt, they're probably pretty low on the
Would
list.
might be fifth on the list.
Man, yeah. So
If even. All right, the last part, the Iron Bowl. There might be some interest here. This is occasionally an interesting game. I say that sarcastically. No, but seriously, this will be fun. Alabama looking a little more mortal than it has in recent years. Alabama's still going to be probably a top 5 team overall. And Auburn, you just never know coming into the season. Auburn does not have the talent it's had probably in past years, but you have seen Auburn have these magical runs, usually shortly following coaching changes. And so the Iron Bowl, always interesting in its own right, but can't wait to see this one.
well, I mean, you're hired to win the Iron Bowl. Like, that's one of the reasons you're
Right.
hired for the
Or
job.
fired
And
if you
so,
don't win it.
right, exactly. And so, like, it's yeah, that's always a big game. It doesn't matter what the expectations are. Like you said, Auburn maybe pick 6th or 7th in the West, but they still want to win the Iron Bowl, and that's still going to be on Hugh Freeze's resume if they do or don't. That's a record that you track, and so yeah, I mean, it's always a big one, and I think it's probably nice for Hugh Freeze to have that game in his own stadium in year one. So yeah, it's just like I've said before, it's really just trying to know what does Auburn look like at that point in the season, and we've said that with Auburn in pretty much every schedule preview we've done so far. We've happened to do quite a few of the West ones, and it really is just kind of you're trying to predict what this team's going to look like, and it's just hard to know right now. So it's a tough schedule nonetheless, and I think that, like we talked about, some of those games, Mississippi State, Arkansas, even though I really think that game at Cal in week 2, tells us a lot about where this team is at roster wise, and how quickly they can sort of transform things offensively, under a guy like Hugh Freeze. So.
All right, we are going to preview every single SEC team's football schedule for the coming year. We're doing this one in early June. Best way to get all those is to hit the subscribe button, enable your notifications so you know when we've got something going on. Hit the like button if you don't mind. That helps our analytics, helps us get noticed by other people. In any case, he is Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee of Southeastern 14. Thanks for watching. We'll be back with more SEC content coming very soon.